Hi, everybody. My name is Sabra Venker, and I'm part of the Theory team. Thank you so much for joining our second live session. I can see already we have more than 200 people joining us today, which is great. I'm so glad all of you could make it. For those of us who joined us on our first talk, we went into a bit of a deep dive with the New York Times bestselling authors Ifosa and Karen from the Clayton Christensen Institute. They talked about theories that were based on the true meaning of innovation and disruption in today's economy. Here at Theory, we aim to bring you not only a depth of knowledge, but a diverse and broad scope of topics as well. So today's talk is going to be a little different, but personally very exciting. Inherently, it'll also be about value creation, but through a new and trailblazing concept called visual engineering. And we'll be talking about this with the founder of this idea, Jack Butcher. He'll be teaching us about what exactly visual engineering is and understanding a new way of creating and seeing the intangible value in your organization or your company. So not only will you be able to clarify and understand your own company's value, you'll be able to communicate it clearly to anyone else, whether it be a stakeholder, an internal employee, or a specific target audience you have in mind. Also, don't forget, type all your questions into the QA tab below as the discussion progresses, and we'll be answering them during the last 20 to 25 minutes of the talk. Before I hand this over to Jack Butcher, one more thing. Our next session, which is next week, Wednesday, we will be having a New York Times bestselling author, Chris Ye, who will be joining us. He'll take us through his very popular New York Times bestseller called Blitzscaling, also co-authored with Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn. So stay tuned, because at the end of this session, you'll be getting a complimentary code to access the event. So to not take up too much more of your time, Jack, I'm gonna send this over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for spending your evening, afternoon, or morning with us, wherever you are. Thank you. Much appreciated. Kick things off here. And thank you to our sponsors and partners here. Thanks, Sabra, for the intro. So today we want to talk about this idea, proving your intellectual capital. And I'm going to be talking about this from the perspective of a firm that I founded a couple of years ago called Visualize Value. And I'm going to break this talk down into 3 topics, and then we're going to have some time for questions. The first is going to be how we learn as people. The second is going to be what invisible value is, how to identify it. And the third is going to be how to visualize value. So we're going to touch on some theory, and then we're going to get into some practical examples. I'm going to spend some time having a conversation at the end here. So I wanted to open with this statement by a friend of mine, David Perell, hot off the press from yesterday. He said, "The world rewards the people who are best at communicating ideas, not the people with the best ideas." So if you remember one thing from this conversation today, I think this is a really powerful idea that we as people, our ability to communicate ideas, our ability to get things done depends upon the quality of our communications, not necessarily the quality of our ideas. So I want to share some of the things that I've been working on for the last couple of years to increase your ability to communicate clearly. So you might think of visual communication as a discipline that is reserved exclusively for creative people or designers or people who have art backgrounds, things of that nature. And I want to dispel that myth. I want to make sure that everybody has access to this discipline. Everybody can leverage these tools to better communicate. So we have a super diverse crowd watching today. We have people working in government. We have people working in the private sector. There's a whole range of different experience and industry on the call today, and this discipline applies across the board, whether you're a business of one or you're working in a multinational corporation with tens of thousands of employees. So we wanted to open it up with a poll and get just a gut feel from everyone on the phone. Do you consider yourself a visual learner? So we want to get some results on that just to tee things up. Give you a couple of seconds to answer here. Sabra, can you share the results of that poll? I don't know if I can see it on my end. 95%. Okay, good results. 95% yes, 5% no. Great. So that makes this story even more compelling. So how do we learn? Let's get some foundational context here before we go into this idea of visual engineering. And I want to start by sharing this quote from a book called Psycho-Cybernetics and an author called Maxwell Maltz. And he says, the fielder must take into account the speed of the ball, the curve of fall, direction, wind speed, velocity, the rate of progress, and the decrease in velocity. He doesn't think about any of this. He just runs. And what this is pointing to are the thousands and thousands of visual calculations that we're making on the fly at all times. We have this inherent ability to communicate visually that's always working, and there are all these calculations that we're making at all times, and we're not necessarily conscious of these decisions, but we know where to be where the ball arrives. So in the case, I know there's not a lot of baseball being played in the Middle East, but we think about soccer or any other sport, all these calculations, they aren't spreadsheets in our heads, they're just things that we inherently understand. We are visual problem-solving machines, and to prove that point, I wanted to demonstrate with another challenge here and ask you to complete this sequence. So if you read the first three here, how long does it take for you to figure out what the next iteration of this pattern is? It takes a little while to figure out. Not a difficult equation to figure out, but it certainly takes a little while. And then I want to offer up the alternative to that. So if we present that as a visual equation, how much faster can you solve it? Exponentially faster, I would like to assume. I'm not going to run a poll on that, but assuming with the 95% result, that's a faster time to reach the result there. So to back that up with some research, we have some MIT and Cambridge research that demonstrates the speed at which we recognize an image, 30 milliseconds, versus the speed at which we recognize a word. So 30 milliseconds for us to process an image and have that, all of the context of that image enter our brain, whereas a word takes us 200 milliseconds to process, not to mention figuring out the context where that word sits among the rest of the words to create the additional context. Beyond the speed at which we process images, there's this additional layer of occupying common ground visually. So the reference points that we share verbally, the reference points that we share with words are a little narrower because we all have different vocabularies, we all speak different languages, we all have different pop culture references, we all just refer to these different ideas to share these verbal references and come to these conclusions that we have the same understanding, versus visuals. There are all these layers of visual communication that we inherently understand. This diagram is a good example of that. Doesn't matter what language you speak, you interpret this idea as there is more overlap, there are more things in common in this scenario than the previous scenario. So we're talking about visual references just creating more common knowledge and a better ability for us to communicate and collaborate with one another. So I want to run another poll now and ask you if you've ever been in a situation where your words have been misinterpreted. I'm also going to put my microphone on here. Okay, we'll give that a couple more seconds. Okay, how do we stand on that poll? Have your words ever been misinterpreted? another 95% result. So we seem to have 5% of us in the words camp, 95% in the words plus additional context camp. So to move on from that, I want to share this idea of learning by example. So what does it mean to learn by example, and why is learning by example such a powerful mechanic for us as people? There's another great quote to share here by a guy named Jed McKenna. He said, "You learn to swim by jumping into the water and swimming, not by sitting in a classroom studying aquadynamic theory." And the reason for that is you're engaging more of your senses. So the more senses you have engaged, the faster you learn, the more kind of porous your memory is. So the more inputs we get and the more feedback we get, the faster we're able to absorb and use an idea. So want to follow that up with the great Albert Einstein. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So teaching somebody to swim in a classroom is incredibly difficult. Throwing some armbands on somebody and putting them in a swimming pool, not as difficult. So what we want to talk about here is how we can leverage visuals to better teach people. And the example I want to use, let's rewind a couple thousand years and think about the idea of a tool and how a tool proliferates among a population. So if you had language as the device to explain how to make and use a tool, you really are kind of shortchanging the speed at which you can make that technology scale. So imagine explaining this idea of what an axe is to somebody that has no reference point of what an axe is or what it does or what it's for. Not to mention they don't understand all of the components that go together to make the axe, versus showing up with the axe and using it for what it was intended for, and all of that teaching, all of those ideas are communicated in the context of the use of the tool. And you as a observer now have the context not only of how to use the tool, but of how to build it. You know what it's made from, you know how to assemble the pieces to make it happen. So anything we can make visual, any process, any tool, any advantage that we have that we can see, it spreads faster. People are able to emulate it and leverage it and create more value with it. In the same way, an axe is, allowing us to gather resources to further civilization. There are tools that exist today, and let's fast forward a couple thousand years here. Most of us aren't in a position where we're swinging axes at trees, and that relationship between physical assets and intangible assets has now drastically flipped. So 80% of the value of the S&P 500 today is made up of intangible assets. So the things that we can't see, the things in our organizations that aren't, real estate or inventory or hard assets. So you have a really small portion now of value in the economy that is attributed to tangible assets. The rest is completely intangible. So what do we mean by intangible assets? This term, intellectual capital, which is what our conversation is about today, is how we categorize all of these things that cannot be physically grouped together. So you can't point at it necessarily. It doesn't exist in the physical world, but it creates a massive amount of value, and it creates the competitive advantage that drives 80% of the economy. So it's the people in your organization, it's the relationships you have both internally and with your customers, it's the goodwill that you've built up into brand, it's the things that people understand about your business that are intangible. It's the feelings people have about your business. It's the culture that you've built to serve your customers better. It's all of these problem-solving processes and ideas that you've fostered over years and years and years that are creating this advantage going forward. So one great example, we wanted to give a regional example of this, and we're going to use the ride-sharing company Careem, the equivalent of the Uber for anyone listening in the States. And the idea here is that there is no massive, and the 80-20 split is probably even more aggressive here. So the IP that drives this business is the software, the talent that builds that software, the agreements that have been put into place with municipalities, the relationships that exist between collaborators and drivers, and all of this IP is intangible, but without it, there really is no business there. So this is an increasingly common quality of businesses that are accelerating away from the pack in terms of the value they're creating and the amount of revenue they can generate without hard assets. So to build on that idea, I wanted to talk about something that is quite economically relevant right now. So another regional example, if we think about a country that is a net exporter of physical goods. So you play in the tangible asset side of the spectrum. You are capped by the price of an asset as it is determined by a global market, versus a company that has an intangible advantage and this exponential relationship with its customers, with its internal staff, things of that nature. So there's another comparison I want to make here, which is atoms versus bits. So we can think about these things like atoms being you're constrained by the physical existence of something, your ability to extract it, store it, move it, in the case of something like oil, versus bits where you're building software, you're building relationships, you're building reputation and brand with your customers, and you have the ability then to kind of shift models. So the model on the left here is really the situation where you build a product, you sell it, or you package a product and you sell it. You then build another product, you sell it. You have these physical goods changing hands. On the right-hand side, this is an entirely different model, which is more congruent with this idea of intellectual capital, where we have this central point. We're building an asset, we're creating something that has intangible value, that's able to deliver a benefit to an end consumer, but it doesn't require us to duplicate it 1,000. Well, we do duplicate it 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, but there's just a marginal cost of replication, instead of on the left-hand side where we're really just in an arbitrage situation there. So the right-hand side is the model that businesses like Careem are operating on, and businesses like a lot of the S&P now have these advantages that exist purely in IP that allow them to scale almost infinitely. So I wanted to also contextualize that with a quote from one of my favorite thinkers, Naval Ravikant. He's a founder of AngelList and a venture investor over here in the States. And he has this great statement where he says, "Earn with your mind, not your time." And the kind of conceptual framework here is, on the left-hand side, we have this, we're building things that have zero cost of replication. We're building assets that the more energy we put into them, the greater they get, but they cost us minimal amount to distribute beyond that. Versus on the right-hand side, we're trading time for money, or we're selling physical goods. We have a cap, a limitation on the number of hours of the day, or how many physical goods we can actually produce. So this is the difference between leveraging your intellectual capital on the left-hand side here versus, this physical arbitrage game where you're selling product. So how do you accelerate intellectual capital? I want to talk about the idea that we can expand upon that previous idea of just the relationship with the customer that you have, but this is important at every level of your organization. So we had a conservative estimate in here that 70% of people learn visually. We know now from our earlier poll, at least this small subsection of people that we're reviewing on this call, there's 95% of people learn visually. So if you are communicating the benefits of your business without visual communication, you're losing out on 9/10 of the population or 7/10 of the population, depending on the data set we're looking at. So that applies to your internal communications. If only 5% of people can understand what you're saying, if you're not using visuals, the speed at which your company or your organization or your government can enact change and implement new ideas is drastically bottlenecked by the amount of understanding you can create among people. So if we have a baseline of visual communication, everybody understands what's happening visually,
then we create this environment where everybody progresses at the same pace. If you're pitching a startup idea without a visual model of how it works, the chances of you connecting with as many investors as you want to be connecting with are drastically reduced, right? From the get-go, you're cutting your market down to conservatively 30% of people, based on the data in this conversation, 5% of people. So there's a huge amount of leverage to be had by mastering visual communication. So if 80% of your value is intangible and 70% of people learn visually, this is, some back of envelope, a couple of assumptions in here, but 56% of your business is open to misinterpretation. So there's all this invisible value that's not being surfaced, that's not being leveraged, that just hasn't been able to be applied and extracted to its full potential. So how do we make the invisible visible? And it really relies on us going back to those shared symbols we have. So earlier in the document, we talked about this small overlap in verbal communication that we have, and the greater overlap that exists between these visual symbols that we all inherently understand by way of just navigating the world and being familiar with these concepts that kind of transcend language. So a sequence of events, the commonality, the overlap between ideas, scale obviously is a huge one. We just calculate scale really, really quickly. There's these gestural data, these gestural ways to display data that don't necessarily need to be plotting thousands and thousands of data points, but they help us conceptually communicate the relationship between two ideas or four ideas. There's a few different frameworks you can use there, but this isn't necessarily about taking data and plotting it. It's about showing the relationship between concepts. Progress is another thing that can be visualized really compellingly, and the spectrum. So where does this idea sit between two variables? Where are we in a certain stage of a journey? We have contrast as a great device, known objects. So there are, things that we've used. The abacus is a great example. There are objects that we've globally referenced as representative of an idea. And then the final piece here in this presentation, at least, there are hundreds of these devices, but the relationships that exist between different parts of a business, how information flows through a business, the sequence in which things occur. There are all these devices that you look at them and you inherently have these layers of understanding that are significantly deeper than reading a paragraph of text. And I'm not advocating against using copy. This is a better with scenario. So how do you create visual leverage? How do you apply this idea to a business, to a communication problem, to what does it actually do? If we apply this idea, we've been talking about a lot of theory, but how do we get that to actually make a difference in an organization? So I want to share a real example of a client of mine. We met these guys. They have a direct to consumer accelerator. So they have everything from manufacturing, supply chain, brand, web presence, digital advertising, content distribution. So they can take a idea in someone's head. Someone's passionate about X and they want to launch a direct to consumer product. They can take that and turn that into a full-on idea, manufactured, delivered, distributed, marketed at somebody's door. So it's a huge idea to communicate. And until very recently, they're communicating that on the phone, or they're getting in a meeting room and they're laboriously going through every stage of the process. Versus after this exercise we went through, let's articulate that visually. How does that actually come to life? What are the relationships between part A of the process, part B of the process, who's involved where, what sequence of events needs to happen for us to go from A to B to C to D? And that completely transformed the way their clients view their business, the way their prospects view their business. They went from this, kind of banging down doors and trying to close sales. Again, 10% close rate. So likely that split in the population that understands visuals versus doesn't. And made a massive difference. They now have a 6-month waiting list, and people pay up front to attend workshops where they work through this process that's been outlined in advance. So not only is this a great marketing tool, but it keeps their operations internally really well aligned and well oiled, and everybody understands what their role is, how to sell the product, how to work on the product, how to deliver the services. So it kind of performs this function that serves every stakeholder of an organization internally, and gives you much more leverage when you're talking to consumers as well. So I want to speak to how this is not only a concept that can be leveraged to articulate business concepts, right? So I think visuals are something that we encounter as babies, toddlers, children, and there are visual connotations to everything we see. So one of the challenges that I set myself over the last couple of years is translating these, using visual leverage to translate these philosophical concepts that everybody can get something from, right? So there's a huge amount of wisdom stored in language over the years. This is a great quote from Lao Tzu: "The best fighter is never angry." While that's a really powerful quote, can we add some additional context to that quote with visuals? So how would you go about figuring out how to visualize a quote like that? And the way I think about it is, you need to make a comparison, right? A lot of our ability to figure things out visually comes down to making comparisons and using contrast. So what is the opposite of angry? It's calm, it's collected, it's, level-headed. What does angry feel like? What would that feeling look like if we translated it to a visual? And what does the opposite of that angry feeling look like? So super simple visual, and it just adds an additional layer of context to an idea. So you can kind of feel some of those emotional implications in this image based on the form that we're using here. And this is abstract. There are obviously different degrees of abstraction and specificity that go into this process, but this has been a really interesting challenge to not just do this for business models and commerce and supply chains, but to add additional visual context to these ideas that have traveled through culture for thousands of years, and try and reach more people with them, right? So if 95% of people learn visually, then an idea, if we can increase the velocity of an idea with visuals, and we reach a significant amount more people. So I want to end the presentation just by sharing a couple of real examples. And one other caveat I wanted to add is data visualization is a very specific discipline, and I'm not by any means talking about pure play data visualization. This is much more about concept visualization. So how do we take somebody from a state of not understanding something to understanding something? So it's about getting the concept across. I want to share just a couple of anecdotal transformations that happened as a result of going through this process. So this is a supply chain example, and these guys now, again, a hyper complex problem that they're trying to communicate verbally and in reports and long form written copy. Not only are you up against a hyper declining attention span, but you just really, you have really, really complex processes to explain. So this has been transformational in their business. People get it straight away. It unlocks a lot of value for them moving forward, not only in their sales process, but in, again, how they train their staff, how their investors look at the future of their business, how they articulate their competitive advantage long term. So you walking into a meeting and saying we are better than X is one thing, but being able to visualize that and support it with real data, but have the conceptual visualization of what you believe and how you're going to implement all of those advantages creates a massive amount of leverage in an organization. The next example is, this is a service that generates leads for professional service businesses, and it's hyper complex digital ad targeting and layers of software and integrations and plugins and data analytics and all of those really heady, complex subjects. And what these guys have done in collaboration with us, has distilled this down into a really just to a conceptual level. How can you understand what it is we're doing here? And it just creates this epiphany on the client side where they understand instantly, okay, now I understand the only gap between where I am now and where I need to be is what you're doing. I don't need to learn data science, so I don't need to understand lookalike audiences and targeting and ad spend and all of these really, really nuanced concepts. All I need to understand is the framework and the concept that underlies what you do. It's kind of the philosophy of your business. If you can articulate that, you can really start to build really great relationships with people. I'll skip over this one because we already talked about it, but the direct-to-consumer brand had a massive uptick in both inbound leads and just the structure of their business after implementing this visual engineering process. So they went from this time and materials situation where they're getting paid 60 days at a time and kind of chasing after business to putting a product out in the market where they own the IP. They've articulated their intellectual capital and people are coming to them. They really want to go through this process and have them just demonstrate or please put my company and my idea through this process. I want to see what you can make possible for me. So completely changed the business model because they're able to articulate it visually. And the last example I wanted to share, and I think this is universally relevant, internally, externally, is the idea of turning your intellectual capital into intellectual property, right? You have these processes within your business. You have the ways in which your teams collaborate, the way you think about problems, the way you solve problems that can be packaged into products essentially that free up your time to think strategically, to allocate resources to forward planning. So all of these things that we find ourselves showing up to do every day, the repetitive tasks that for whatever reason aren't happening on autopilot because they haven't been documented in a way that the understanding within the organization is at a level where somebody that does understand it doesn't have to intervene every time. So creating assets that really build systems inside your organization, and systems are one thing, understanding how a system operates is one thing, but being able to communicate that to a wider segment of your organization really unlocks a lot of value, both internally and externally. So whatever it is you do, whatever projects you're working on, whoever it is you're communicating with, there's a huge amount of leverage to be had by making your thoughts visual and translating those concepts into a language that more people can understand. So with that, I wanted to ask a final question and just see, based on this presentation, based on what we've been talking about, do you have an interest in developing your own visual communication skills? Do you see value in adding this skill to your toolbox, to your organization, to the way you communicate? Oh, 99%. Good stuff. All right, awesome. Great. So with that said, let's fire up the questions and have a discussion. Thank you all for listening. I know that was a dense amount of information, but I really appreciate you listening to it. Thank you. I'm going to fire up the Q&A box here. Okay, a lot of questions. Let me scrub through a few here. Okay. Oh, cool. So these are voted up. So Brendan asks, how can non-designers get better at translating our concepts and messaging into visuals? So it's a great question, Brendan. And I think there's a long-winded answer here. I'm gonna give a high level reaction, and hopefully this will kind of set you on the path. But there are a lot of tools that exist. I will figure out a way to distribute that to everyone that watch this, like some of the tools that you can go after and learn. But from a perspective of constructing ideas in a way that you can visualize, you really do just have to think in terms of transformation. So the essence of like good communication is that the empathy to understand like where someone is and where they want to be. And in the case of, pretty much any valuable venture, any business, they are creating that transformation, right? So think about both the logical side of it, like what are the pieces of the business that need to fit together to achieve that result? What sequence of events has to happen? I think that's one way to think about it chronologically, and build out the sequence of events and the relationship to those events and people. The other is, what are the specific transformations that take place? So in the case of the direct-to-consumer brand, the first part of that process is taking this idea that someone has. So let's say someone has wants to build a skincare brand, let's say. We have to understand like how to take that desire from inside somebody's head, that all of the experience and knowledge and connections that they've made in that world, and turn that into a marketable product. So there are a bunch of inputs that occur there. It's market research, it's understanding how many people we can realistically reach, what the price point of the product is. So that transformation is this ethereal idea into a business plan, for example. So what are the transformations that are occurring at each part of the journey, and how can you articulate those visually? Let me know if that helps, Brennan. I'm trying to pull up the chat here as well. Oh, okay. The most challenging ideas you had to visualize. That's a great question. Dr. Peter Stojanov. Most challenging idea I had to visualize. Honestly, the direct-to-consumer brand was a pretty tough one. There is so much intricacy in that world, and supply chain, freight modeling, really exponentially complicated concepts. So if you look at a spreadsheet, or if you look at the kind of P&L and the like numerical operations of a supply chain company, it's insane. It's really difficult to interpret. So that challenge really comes down to like what is necessary to communicate and what can be taken out without distracting from the point, without removing too much detail that we're underselling what we're doing, or we're not communicating the extent of our expertise. It becomes about this really like delicate balance between what to show and what not to show. Dana, so materials, books, websites, and tools we can use for intellectual capital. So I think this is almost a bigger idea than one book or one idea can capture. I think honestly, studying the businesses you admire, or studying these companies that do have a like massive advantage due to the fact that they've built up this intellectual capital. So I would definitely recommend, I reference him in this document, reading Naval Ravikant's work. He's been in the venture space for a long time and built and funded a lot of digital businesses. He's written and spoken extensively about the idea of intellectual capital and software as leverage and zero cost of replication. So there's a lot. He's a huge inspiration of mine, and I think studying his ideas are a great place to start to learn about that stuff. Morgan asks, can you talk about using video, pros and cons versus images? Also the investment required, video being harder to produce. So Morgan, there's, yeah, video is an interesting challenge, and you have to think about the, I think of the two disciplines differently. There's definitely, like, visual engineering has this graphic and geometric component to it. So there's, you can set that in motion, which I wouldn't necessarily categorize as video, or you can have like live action video. So, you know, a scripted narrative where you have characters and people interacting and telling a story that way, versus motion graphics and making graphic content move. I would say, honestly, the investment required to make high quality video is like inordinately more expensive than making great graphic content. And if your intention is to communicate a point quickly, as we demonstrated in this presentation, a video requires you to watch it. So you have to sit with it to get to the point. A single image or a sequence of single images allows you to go at your own pace. So I think we're in an era now of, you know, I want to consume at the rate I want to consume. If it's going to take you 4.5 minutes to make your point, and you can still make that point with a sequence of 5, 6, 7 graphics that I can consume 10, 20 seconds at a time, then again, it's about empathy for the viewer. And I think in most cases, you can use visuals more effectively than you can video, and it's going to cost you a lot less. Okay, we got 1 to 2 more questions. Hamden asks how to ensure or minimize the misinterpretation of our visuals. So I think the same way you learn to communicate verbally, there's you can get really fast feedback on your ideas on the internet, whatever social platform you use. But I would also highly recommend that you show your ideas to people that are not in your industry, not in your world. And that's the real test of whether or not you've solved a communication challenge visually. So to go back to the Einstein quote, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it yourself. I think there's another, you know, if you can't explain it to a 6 or 7-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. So if you're able to distill a concept to its essence, then you should be able to communicate to that to somebody that doesn't work in your industry. So that's one component of the answer. The other component is you like work on this skill and develop, iterate to the point where you're becoming a better visual communicator in the same way you would become a better writer. And I think, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, I think that people can and should start to learn this skill. Okay, I'm going to look for one last question here. We've got okay, I'm going to talk about just the software that you can start messing around with. I think there's a lot of free software out there that you can start to use. There's even, within the suite of software that you normally create written content in, your PowerPoints or your keynotes of the world, Google Slides. I personally like Figma and Sketch. They're a little bit more, they give you a little bit more flexibility. I'm working on something right now to help people figure out how to learn Figma and how to build content brands and visualize ideas. So I think there's going to be a way for us to get in touch about that after this. That unfortunately is all the time we have for questions. So I'm going to hand it back over to, sorry. If you would be so kind as to leave some feedback at this link here, theory.ae/feedback. We want to keep making these sessions better and really appreciate your input. And again, if you submit to that survey, you're going to get you're going to get access to the next session, which is going to be phenomenal, complimentary. So please head to that link and fill out the survey. And again, thank you so much for listening to today's conversation. It has been a pleasure. If there are any other questions you have, please find me on Twitter and I'll answer any questions you have. It's just at Jack Butcher.
Thank you for that, Jack. So good news is we've had around 350 people joining us from around the world, which has been absolutely amazing. I'm sure most of you will agree with me when I say that was extremely interesting. I learned a lot personally, and I'm definitely going to take a deeper dive into the world of visual engineering after this, so I hope you do as well. Before we sign off, please don't forget, as Jack mentioned, to log on to our survey. You can see that link on the screen, theory.ae/feedback. Also, sign up now for our next session with Chris. We have the website link on screen where you can sign up and use the complimentary access code that we have on screen as well, which is only valid for 24 hours. So the sooner the better. Both links that I mentioned will be posted in the chat as well. And of course, don't forget to follow our social media accounts to stay informed for our next talks and any upcoming events. So everybody, thanks for joining us, and we will see you again next week.
Thanks, everyone.